I see someone in the audience from Saturn, which is amazing. Probably our first webinar attendee from outer space. We've got Wisconsin, Pittsburgh, different counties in Chicago area, and different neighborhoods in Chicago. So a great audience so far. Thanks, everybody. If you're just joining, oh, someone from Frankfurt, Germany. Very cool. If you're just joining, feel free to say hello, introduce yourself on the chat, and we'll get started in just about a minute or two. We got Sue joining from the Trailside Museum, which is amazing. Glenview, Southwest Michigan, Indiana. Lamont, thanks for folks joining from all over. And if you're just tuning in, hello and welcome. Welcome to the first webinar of the Friends of the Forest Preserves, second round of the Hidden Life of the Forest Preserves webinar series. We're going to get started in just about 2 or 3 minutes to allow all of our guests to tune in and join the webinar tonight. While you're waiting, feel free to say hello in the chat on the right-hand side of your Zoom screen and let us know where you're tuning in from. We're just going to be starting in just another minute or two, so make sure to say hello and then we'll start the show. And thanks for everybody's participating. Evanston, more folks with good experiences at Trailside, Chicago. Lots of folks turning in. Thank you. Mary in the chat panel just asked where we are from. We're all field organizers with the Friends of the Forest Preserves. Currently, I'm in Edgewater right now, but spending time in forest preserves throughout the county. We got Park Forest, Avondale, Berwyn. Awesome. DeKalb, Pennsylvania. For the question in the audience about the display, once Derek starts the presentation, the presentation will take over the whole screen and you'll just see the small portion of the videos, so that'll get bigger soon. We got folks from Indiana, Northbrook, Appleton, Wisconsin, all over the country and the nation. So thanks so much for joining, and international folks tuning in too. Thanks. We'll go ahead and get started. Thank you, everybody, and welcome to the Hidden Life of the Forest Preserves webinar series. We're so glad you joined us this evening and hope you walk away with some new information about cool mushrooms and frozen fungi, and that you walk away inspired to explore the hidden world of the forest preserves of Cook County and be mindful of all the little things hidden in the world around us, those that we can't see in the winter and those that are just coming to life in spring. My name is Peter Whitney, and I'm the Spring Creek field organizer here with the Friends of the Forest Preserves. Friends unites to protect, promote, and care for the forest preserves in Cook County. As an independent nonprofit organization, we're solely focused on the forest preserves of Cook County, and we work tirelessly to safeguard and improve the 70,000 acres of forest preserves for all of us and for all of the generations to come. We're so glad to connect with you today, and we are starting in-person small group programs in the field again. I'm sure there's some volunteers in the audience that have been coming out to work days, and that's where we love to be, but we're also really excited to provide online programs to connect with you tonight and provide accessible ways to reach folks all over the county, all over the world, and connect over our love of nature. So a few housekeeping notes before I turn it over to Derek. During right now or throughout the presentation, feel free to type in any questions into the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen, and they'll either be answered live during the Q&A session at the end of the presentation, or if we don't get to your question, we'll be sure to follow up either live during the session over text or over email after the fact. And lastly, just to let everyone know, this session is being recorded. So if you missed part of it or you're having connection issues or you couldn't join, it will be posted to YouTube for later viewing. Awesome. And for folks that are joining, feel free to say hello in the chat and introduce where you're coming from. But we're going to be starting with Derek's presentation here. So before we get started, we're going to start with the Friends of the Forest Preserve's land acknowledgement statement. The Friends of the Forest Preserve acknowledges that the forest preserves in Cook County are located on the ancestral homelands of the Council of the Three Fires, a long-standing Anishinaabe alliance of the Ojibwe or Chippewa, Ottawa or Odawa, and Potawatomi North American Native tribes. These lands have also been home and continue to be home and a place of trade for so many other tribes, including the Fox, Ho-Chunk, Menominee, Muskowa, Muskogees, Miami, and Sauk people. For centuries, the Native Americans cared for and protected these lands until ownership was largely stolen from them by US colonizers. Today, we employ certain land management techniques that follow indigenous practices, but however, our forest preserves and our communities would greatly benefit from a more intentional application of indigenous knowledge in how we manage and how we honor our protected areas. Chicagoland is home to one of the largest and most diverse urban Native American communities in the United States. Community members celebrate, practice, and adapt their heritage and traditions with our modern urban environment. And it's really our responsibility to find common cause with the community members and support their engagement with the forest preserves. So we ask you, along with us, the Friends of the Forest Preserves, to offer gratitude, respect, and support to the many Native American people, including their ancestors, who consider the lands and the waters within Cook County sacred. And please join us in carrying on a legacy of respect and active caretaking for our earth, for us, and for future generations. If you want to know more about Friends of the Forest Preserves and our commitments to, or would like to learn more about our land acknowledgement statement, you can visit the homepage of our website where it is posted there. So without any further ado, I'm going to mute myself and hand it over to Derek Ziomber. He's the North Branch field organizer of the Friends of the Forest Preserves and our featured presenter tonight. And I'll turn it over to you, Derek. Thank you.
Okay, let me know if you all can hear me.
We can hear you.
Great. Let me just get some stuff set up real quickly. Okay, so I'm Derek Ziomber, North Branch field organizer with Friends of the Forest Preserves, and we'll just begin. I'll start off with a little bit about myself and what I'll be presenting today. So that's me on the right there, and this photo is by Dan Kasperger, a volunteer that on the North Branch. Most of the photos in this presentation will be photos that I've taken, but some photos I borrowed from other places. I'll talk a little bit about Friends, although you already heard a bit about that. I'll talk about Forest Preserves of Cook County, go into an intro for fungi and mushrooms, then talk about a few specific fungi you can find in the winter and spring and other cooler seasons. I'll also talk about ecological interactions between fungi, plants, and wildlife, then go into how and where to find mushrooms, and some ID resources, and then closing, and we'll open it up to questions. So, and a little bit about myself. I grew up on the northwest side of Chicago. I spent a lot of time in the forest preserves and natural areas around Chicago as a kid. And I'm not a mycologist, but I'm a very enthusiastic amateur, I'd like to say. And I guess you've already seen our mission statement. This is a cool photo that demonstrates our mission. This is volunteers, Friends of the Forest Preserve staff, Forest Preserve of Cook County staff, our partner organizations. Some people are in this picture. So yeah, we like the forest preserves, we want to protect them and we want other people to enjoy them as well. So the forest preserves of Cook County cover about 70,000 acres. We're the oldest and largest county forest preserve system in the country. It covers about 11% of the county, which is surprising in such an urban environment. And that's about half the size of the entire city of Chicago. You can compare that to the size of Indiana Dunes National Lakeshore National Park now, which is about 15,000 acres. This red circle right here, that's the Palos region of the county. That's about 15,000 acres itself. And here is the North Branch of the Chicago River where I spend most of my time. And the forest preserves are a little bit different from a park system. They're not just for the enjoyment of people, they're for preservation of plants and wildlife and fungi as well. So here are various different types of mushrooms you can see in Cook County. These are all photos I've taken in the county, in the forest preserves. These are not the types of fungi that I'm really going to talk about today for the most part, because these are mostly not winter or spring mushrooms. But it's a really cool diversity that you can find in this surprisingly urban environment. A little disclaimer before we get going. I'm not going to talk about edibility or toxicity of mushrooms. This isn't a webinar about foraging. Consuming a mushroom is an inherently dangerous thing. There are deadly poisonous mushrooms everywhere. It can be hard to distinguish them from non-deadly poisonous mushrooms. But that doesn't really matter for our purposes because it is illegal to remove any sort of fungi or natural or cultural materials from forest preserve land without permission. Yeah, there's just too many people. We have about 9 million people in Cook County, and we let people forage. We have to let everybody forage. Now I'll get into fungi. So first, fungi, they are not the same. They're not plants. They're not animals. They used to be thought to be more closely related to plants. They were even thought to be primitive plants, but in reality, they're more closely related to animals, and they split off from animals and plants later on. So they're actually maybe more advanced. There are about 144,000 described species, but somewhere around 3 million species that have not been described. There are new fungi being discovered all the time, thanks to DNA studies and more close examination of what we've already seen. And you can compare that to plants, where there are about 400,000 described species and maybe 100,000 left undescribed. So fungi are way more diverse than plants. They range from unicellular organisms, which you can see in this bottom picture. That's a scanning electron microscope photo of yeast cells, and they can range up to the largest creatures on the planet, covering 2,200 acres up to, or maybe even more. So the largest living organism is actually a humongous fungus that's in Oregon in the Malheur National Forest. Yeah, and this upper photo, that's an aerial photo that they used special camera equipment to show it because this is a fungus that mostly lives underground. It does produce mushrooms, but most of the time you can't see it. And the wider areas are all areas where this humongous fungus, which is a type of honey mushroom, killed off the trees. Fungi basically live everywhere, all continents, hydrothermal vents, deep sea sediments, inside of human bodies, on space stations, on the outside of spacecraft in low Earth orbit, and then also inside of nuclear reactors. They've been found inside of the Chernobyl reactors, and they're actually fungi that use radioactive energy as a source of energy. So that's pretty amazing, if you ask me. So what actually is the fungus? They're composed of hyphae, which are microscopic threads. And when these microscopic threads, they'll knit together to form different structures. And the underground vegetative part the actual fungus itself is referred to as a mycelium. There can be about 300 feet of hyphae in a single cubic centimeter of soil, but it's usually microscopic. It's not always going to be as obvious as these photos over here, which show some visible mycelia. This bottom picture, you can actually see mushrooms starting to form from the mycelia. And the mushroom itself is actually hyphae woven together in different patterns and such. They have the mycelia, because they're so small and they can fit in the soil so well, they have an extremely high surface area. And the way that they eat and get their nutrients is kind of interesting. They secrete enzymes into the environment and then absorb it. To put this in human terms, it would be kind of like if you vomited onto your food, let it sit for a while, and then rolled around in it. It's a very different strategy than what you see in animals or plants or a lot of other things. Kind of maybe more similar to bacteria in that sense. They can degrade or decompose a variety of materials. They're the most important decomposers that there are. You know, hydrocarbons, chemicals, of course, plant and animal matter. They can use it all. They can destroy it all. They can be parasites, and they can be mutualists, so symbiotic fungi that benefit other plants that they interact with or other creatures. They decompose things, and there are even predatory fungi that use their hyphae to create little lassos that capture nematodes and other things and then kill them. So there's a lot of different things that they do. Here's an example of a different kind of mycelium. This is actually the mycelium of a honey mushroom, the type of fungus that creates these humongous fungi in some instances. So what's a mushroom? Mushroom and fungi are not necessarily synonymous. There are a lot of fungi that do not produce mushrooms. Molds on breads, yeasts, lichens are not considered mushrooms. A lot of pathogens and mycorrhizal fungi. The mushroom itself is really just a structure meant for reproduction and for the production of spores, which are kind of like seeds, but not exactly. They're almost always microscopic. And the fungus is sometimes referred to as a fruit or a fruit body. So I might use that term interchangeably with mushroom later on. Mushrooms and fungi in general, they have a very complex life cycle. I'm not going to go into it, and their life cycles vary across different lineages of fungi. Here's a simplified diagram of their life cycle. And one thing to complicate fungal reproduction, they don't just have two sexes, they can have thousands of sexes. This is a split gill mushroom, very common throughout the world. It's been found that it has over 23,000 different sexes. So if you think that human reproduction is complicated, start reading about fungal reproduction. Here's a little primer on the anatomy of a mushroom. This is probably what you think about when you think of a mushroom. They have a cap, they have a stem, they have gills on the underside of the cap, and the gills are where these reproductive spores are produced. Not all fungi not all mushrooms have every one of these parts. Not all of them have gills. And different winter fungi, they generally will not look quite like this, but we'll get more of that later. So what happens to fungi in the winter? Some go dormant. They just stop any activity, just maintain themselves. Some die and restart their life cycle. There are cold-adapted fungi. As I mentioned, they live in all environments, including the Arctic and Antarctic. And then some fungi, they will keep growing in the soil or other areas that don't freeze. So if you go deep enough, the soil might not be frozen and you might have active fungi. Most mushrooms don't fruit in the winter, but some do. This picture is actually a fungus, a mushroom that I found a few weeks ago during a really cold spell that we had of sub-zero temperatures. On the left side it looks like it's actively growing. Whereas the right side, it's brown and it's dying off. So it seems like that was a mushroom that can handle freezing, very cold temperatures. Some mushrooms are perennial. They continue to grow throughout the winter, especially if it's warmer temperatures. They might not produce spores in those temperatures, but once it gets warmer, they'll resume their activity. And then some mushrooms, they'll just pop up really quickly during a warm spell in the winter and then disappear once it gets colder. But in any case, you don't want to discount winter as a good time to look for mushrooms. There are mushrooms that prefer colder seasons and that grow in the winter, even though you won't find as many softer mushrooms. As I said, they might pop up. But in the winter, you're really going to be looking for tougher, woody, or leathery mushrooms, and they're usually going to be growing on wood or at least decomposing wood that might be in soil. And some of these winter mushrooms, they're not going to last throughout the year. Some of them, they might last a few weeks, a few months, but winter is a time of year to see some specific mushrooms that you can't see other times of year. And I'll start getting into specific fungi. So here's turkey tail. It's very common on dead logs. You can find this one any time of year, but in the winter, it's a little bit easier to see a lot of these fungi because there aren't leaves and there aren't plants to distract you. I get really easily distracted by plants and other things. So this fungus, it kind of grows in a kidney shape or overlapping shelves or these kind of rounded rosette-like clusters. Its texture is a bit tough. It has a velvety cap on the top side with concentric rings. You can kind of see that in these bottom photos. The underside has white small pores. And for me, this was really the prototypical fungus that I used to compare all the other wood decomposing fungi that I first started seeing when I was learning mushrooms. And that's really helpful because there are a lot of fungi that are similar to turkey tail, and turkey tail can have a lot of different forms. It can be very colorful. Some of them are more brown and white and black or gray, but they can also have shades of green and shades of blue and even iridescent and metallic tones. But there are similar fungi that look like to the turkey tail. This is what I call the yellow turkey tail. It doesn't have a common name, but it's very similar. And then here's another one that can be similar with the violet tooth polypore. It's only purple when it's freshly growing, and then it turns into a more drab looking thing that might resemble a turkey tail if you don't closely examine it. But all these mushrooms, if you start looking at them, they have subtle differences that separate them from the turkey tail. And case in point, here are the false turkey tails. They also grow on dead wood, but they prefer oaks. And they're a few different species of false turkey tail. The main difference is that they're more of a sort of leathery texture. They're thin, they're flexible. Most importantly, they don't have pores on the underside. So they produce their spores on this flat surface. And they can have various different colors. So I'm not going to get into the different species there, but if you turn over a turkey tail and it doesn't have pores, but it's flat, it's going to be a false turkey tail. A different direction, here we have a really tough fungus, the artist bracket. It's also common on dead wood. It can get very large, about over 3 foot diameter. It's tough and woody, and it can live for many years. One of the coolest parts about this fungus is the underside. You turn it over, you scratch these white pores, and they turn dark brown. So you could draw a picture of another mushroom on the underside. But I would not recommend doing this. As I mentioned, this is a perennial fungus. It can grow for decades. It even forms growth rings. You might have noticed those concentric ridges. It forms growth rings like a tree. And if you pull it off, it's dead. That's years of growth down the drain. So they're getting less common, or at least the large ones are. So please don't pull them off. Dryad saddle is another large fungus, and this is one that you're going to find a little bit more in the spring. Also grows on dead wood, but it has a fleshy texture and it becomes rubbery. A lot of these fungi have kind of fanciful names. So maybe this fungus, you can imagine like a fairy or a dryad using it as a saddle on whatever woodland creature it rides around on. It's hard to imagine where these people got these names from. The pores are a little bit different. So here's an example. It has big polygonal pores, and this one has a stem. All the other ones that I talked about don't have stems. Oh, and that's the stem. Another one with a stem, and this is also a little bit more of a spring mushroom. The last one, that dryad saddle, it's not really coming up just yet, but this is a fungus that you could find in the forest preserves right now. It's a classic toadstool type of mushroom. You see this and you think, oh yeah, that's definitely a mushroom. It grows in clusters and it can be orange to like a brick red color. And it gets its name from this velvety black or brown stem that it has. So the velvet foot. Okay, so those are a few kind of common mushrooms that you could go out and look for. Now I'll talk about ecological interactions, specifically wood decomposers. They are the most important decomposers out there. So fungi are actually the only organisms that can effectively degrade lignin in wood. And before fungi evolved this ability, wood was accumulating and accumulating during the Carboniferous period, about 200, over 250 million years ago. And that's where a lot of our coal deposits come from. But at some point, about 250 million years ago, fungi evolved the ability to effectively degrade wood. And once that happens, we stop seeing so much coal in the geologic record. And it's kind of interesting because different fungi use different parts of the wood. They create different types of structures when they decompose wood. So this brown colored degradation, that's just the lignin left over. All the white part got decomposed, and that white part is the cellulose, which is what we use to make paper. Whereas on the left side, on the right side, my fault, that's just cellulose. All the lignin has been decayed, and these two fungi, they might live in the same piece of wood, but they'll use different parts of it. And some fungi also grow during different stages of decomposition. So there's kind of a series of succession that goes on, just like with plants and animals. As the habitat changes, so does the community of fungi. Here's a really cool interaction with wood decomposing fungi and animals. This is a story about the mossy maize polypore, the horntail wasp, and the giant ichneumon wasp. And we'll start this story with the horntail wasp. These are both wasps that get pretty large, but they're completely harmless. The horntail wasp drills into wood, lays its eggs, and then injects little pieces of fungus that it collected into the wood along with its eggs. So as the fungus grows, it feeds the eggs once they hatch and turn into larvae. Here's the mossy maize polypore that this horntail wasp collects little bits and pieces of. It's a wood decomposer, and one of the coolest things about this fungus is that it produces pheromones, so chemicals that waft out on the air, and these chemicals attract the giant ichneumon wasp. So giant ichneumon wasps, they then use the pheromones that the mossy maize polypore creates to locate horntails, and then it drills into the wood as well, and it paralyzes horntail larva and injects an egg directly into the larva. The giant ichneumon larva then consume the horntail larva. It's pretty macabre and a little bit gruesome, but it's pretty awesome. And I saved the photos of this wasp for now because this is just such a cool looking wasp. I actually saw this wasn't in the forest preserves, but it was in a park in Chicago. And on the right side, you can actually see little holes in the wood. And this ichneumon wasp is using its ovipositor, it's not really a stinger, to inject eggs and poison into larvae using a hole that the horntail larva might have actually created itself. So these wasps, they get about 3 inches long, and they have stingers that are about 3 to 4 inches long. But as I mentioned, completely harmless and so cool looking, so alien. So not all the horntails die. They don't all get eaten by the ichneumon. So really what's going on here is that the mossy maize polypore has evolved a way to ensure that it gets spread to good logs, and it's also evolved a way to control the populations of the wasp that eats it. It's really kind of this manipulative thing that's hard to imagine could evolve in nature, but the more that scientists look for these strange interactions, the more they find them. This isn't like a one-off thing. Fungi are interacting with plants and wildlife and everything else in amazing ways that we're really only just starting to understand. But one way that we have a little bit more of an understanding about, one of the ways that they interact that we understand more about, that's mycorrhizal fungi, their interactions with plants. And fungi and mushrooms, they actually colonized land well before plants did. And there's some indication that plants might not have even been able to colonize land without fungi, because of some of the oldest plant fossils from about 400 million years ago, they actually show structures on their roots that look almost identical to structures that we currently see on plant roots. And about 80% of all species currently alive have some sort of mycorrhizal fungus that associates with its roots. And I keep using this word, mycorrhiza. That's Greek for mushroom and root. And what ends up happening is the mycelia of the mushroom or the fungus connects to the roots of plants, and they trade things back and forth. So plants, they can photosynthesize, they create their own food, they create sugars. Fungi do not. With this interaction, the plant trades sugars in return for nutrients and water. That high surface area of the mycelium, it's very effective at absorbing water and nutrients. And then, of course, because fungi are able to degrade different types of materials in the soil that plants can't, they're very good at getting all that extra nitrogen and phosphorus and stuff like that. And it's been shown that plants, when they have these mycorrhizal fungi on their roots, they actually outcompete the plants that don't have it, even if it's the same species. So there's a mutually beneficial interaction going on. That's what symbiosis generally means. Here's a pine seedling with showing the development of a mycorrhizal network. You can see on the right, we have all this white fungal mycelia forming on the roots, and that just extends the reach of the plant roots way beyond what it could be on its own. And now we'll talk about some mycorrhizal fungi and a story specifically about spring and how mycorrhizal fungi in this case are helping plants to green up earlier in the year, or some plants. And this story, our two main players besides the fungus is our trout lily, which is a small spring ephemeral wildflower, and it's a really beautiful. It can form large colonies that live for centuries, but it's a pretty slow growing plant. It can even take 7 years before from seed to the point that it develops flowers. The next player is the sugar maple, common woodland tree, the leaf on the Canadian flag. They both grow in similar woodland environments, and they both can associate with some of the same species of fungi in the soil. So what scientists have found is that trout lily roots, they store nutrients all year long, preventing the nutrients from running off with rain or going deeper into the soil. And what they found is that trout lilies, when they produce their leaves, they start photosynthesizing, they start producing sugars. The sugars get passed into the roots of the trout lily, then they go through the fungus and into the roots of the maple, and then you can find this carbon, which they do these experiments by marking it with a radioactive form of carbon. They find it gets passed from trout lily to maple, and then later in the fall and in the summer, when the trout lily leaves are dead, the maple returns the favor and starts storing energy, passing energy into the trout lily. It's almost like a battery, and in this way, the trout lily can help the maple actually leaf out quicker in the spring. And the same thing with the storage in the roots. The trout lily is able to have more energy to bloom earlier in the spring as well. Yeah, so the moral of the story here is that these sugar maples, trout lilies, and mycorrhizal fungi, they seem to be cooperating in some way to maintain this shadier woodland habitat where they thrive. If it was less shady, maples might not survive as well. They might get outcompeted by oaks. They might get, grasses might come in and crowd out the trout lilies. But this network actually maintains woodlands in some cases, perhaps. And mycorrhizal fungi, they create networks that connect plants across longer distances, even between different species. But there are studies that show that trees of the same species pass nutrients between each other, and especially mother trees that sort of are connected to baby trees, saplings and seedlings that are underneath the canopy and so shaded that they wouldn't be able to get sun and survive if not for being connected to their mother tree through their fungal symbiont. And of course, this idea of fungi being a way to communicate, being a way for plants to communicate. It's kind of been popularized. You can think about Avatar, the movie, but it's not quite as extreme as that. But there probably is some amount of communication going on. Definitely cooperation. Okay, so you've heard about some cool mushrooms you can find in the forest preserves. Now let's think about where you can find these fungi, how you can look for them. So look for trees, look for deadwood, and look for oaks. Prairies generally don't have as many fungi that produce mushrooms. Oaks, on the other hand, oaks can support dozens of species of wood decomposing fungi. A really cool log could have actually dozens of different types of mushrooms growing on it. So the more deadwood, the better, at least in the winter. You're looking for fungi. And you're not really going to find the mycorrhizal mushrooms until spring, and then they don't reach their height until late summer, August and September. This tree right here is actually one of my favorite trees ever at a preserve that I work at. It fell down recently, so it's pretty freshly dead. It doesn't have fungi growing on it, but this is a place that I will be checking regularly to see how it develops and see what mushrooms spring out of it. It was a really big red oak, probably the biggest red oak I've ever seen. So I was kind of sad. But now I won't have to be sad. I'll get to see mushrooms on it. So where are specific spots you can go to look for them in Cook County. I didn't realize that we would have so many people from around the country and even the world. But if you're ever in Cook County, you can look up the Forest Preserve's website. They have an interactive map with all the sites, all the trails in the preserves, and the different activities allowed at each site. But based on my own personal experience, I have a few suggestions. So the North Branch of the Chicago River, there's a pretty famous old book, Annotated Flora of the Chicago Region. This Herman Papoon, he went around the whole county documenting all the plants, and he wasn't really a mushroom guy, but he does specifically say about the North Branch of the Chicago River, it may be surmised that for the mushroom enthusiast, the place is a wonderland. He doesn't say that about any of the other parts of the county, so I figured I'd get that plug in for the North Branch of the Chicago River. But in the Calumet region, we have Sand Ridge Nature Center. I've seen some pretty cool mushrooms there. Along the Des Plaines River, Possum Hollow Woods is another really cool place. A lot of oaks and deadwood there. In Northwest Cook County, I don't have as much experience, but somebody has suggested to me Schaumburg Road grassland east of the parking lot. There's nice woodland with cool mushrooms. And then in the Palos region, Swallow Cliff Woods is a place that I've seen some cool ones. Okay, so you've gone out now and found a bunch of interesting mushrooms. Maybe you're interested in trying to identify them. Well, you probably want to start off by taking pictures, and you should always just take way more pictures than you think you're going to need. People think they can take a picture of the top of a mushroom and get an identification. That's oftentimes not the case. And I'll go through some of this a little bit more, but you really just want to take a picture of every part of the mushroom that you can see. And you should consider posting your photos to iNaturalist. It's a website and an app that has photo recognition software that you can use to get a potential ID. It's not always right, but another added benefit is that people can see your photographs and then suggest an ID. So here's an example. This is a fungus. This actually isn't in Cook County, but it is a mycorrhizal fungus that I posted my pictures to iNat. Cap, underside, and I broke it open. That's something that people don't always do. And if you don't look at the interior of a mushroom, you might miss some really cool stuff. Here, when you break it open, it transforms from white and to this deep cobalt blue just within a few seconds. It's flash. And if you didn't break it open, you would not see that. And that characteristic makes it so easy to ID. I posted it, and then somebody quickly came in and said, yep, I agree. It's not always going to be that quick, but it can be. And it always helps to add a little bit of notes about habitat, notes about different characteristics. You can never add too much when you're trying to ID a mushroom. Okay, mushroom hunting ethics. As I mentioned, it's illegal to remove mushrooms from forest preserves. Some state parks allow people to forage. National forests maybe. You should check your local guidelines and regulations. In general, if you want to get a picture of the underside of a mushroom, you should try to not remove the mushroom from the wood or the ground. But it is acceptable to detach a few small fungi, especially if they're abundant. Remember that mushrooms, they're not meant to last forever. They're ephemeral. They're just like fruit. An apple falls off a tree, it rots away, seeds hopefully grow. Same thing with most mushrooms. The mushroom grows, disperses spores, disappears. And just detaching a mushroom rarely is going to harm the fungus, especially if you take a little bit of care not to disturb it too much. But the exception would be slower growing perennial mushrooms, large mushrooms, and sometimes rarer mushrooms, but it can be hard to know what's rare or what's not. And even conservationists don't even necessarily know what's rare and what's not, because most of the time fungi are not visible. Most of the time they're in the ground or inside of wood. Also, when you go out, really try to avoid harming any of the wildlife or preserve users that you find. There are a lot of sensitive plants and animals in the preserves, and a lot of times the places that have the best mushrooms also have some of the best plants and wildlife. So don't want to go out and look for mushrooms and then trample all over some rare or endangered species. And you don't want to contribute to erosion, which can be a real problem in Cook County, where we have 9 million people. Also, be aware of mushroom poachers. Try not to share your locations for where you find mushrooms with people who might pick them illegally. And if you do see anybody poaching mushrooms and you feel comfortable reporting it, you can report that to the Forest Preserve Police Department. Now, some recommendations for resources on how to ID mushrooms. I have two favorite field guides. I started off with the National Audubon Society's field guide. It's a little bit more user-friendly. It has a lot of great pictures. You basically just match pictures, and it does go in depth into the different species, but it's not as technical as Mushrooms Demystified, which is a few hundred pages long and has a bunch of dichotomous keys, little guides for identifying fungi. It does cover Western mushrooms more than Eastern mushrooms, but it covers Eastern mushrooms. And I suggest that if you want to get even somewhat serious about identifying mushrooms, just take the plunge, get Mushrooms Demystified, and go from there. There are a lot of good websites as well, mushroomexpert.com, Messiah EDU. Mushroom Observer is a little bit more technical than iNaturalist. It does have a lot of people who are kind of mushroom experts, but it's not as user-friendly. And then there are also Facebook groups. They can be hit or miss. It depends on the level of expertise of the people in the group. But if you really want to connect with mushroom experts, mycological associations are going to be your best bet. In Illinois, we have the Illinois Mycological Association, and then there's also North American Mycological Association. They're mycologists, people who study fungi for a living. They're part of these, as well as amateur experts, and they oftentimes lead little trips to go look for fungi that they refer to as forays. And how can you help fungi and mushrooms in Cook County? So support the forest preserves, or wherever you are, support broader efforts to conserve natural habitats, spread the word about how cool fungi are and how important they are. But if you want to directly do something to help fungi, volunteer. You can contact me or any of the other field organizers at Friends to learn more. We can help you find a place where you can volunteer, and look at, we can help you find the schedule of upcoming volunteer work days. We do mainly focus on plants, especially oaks in Cook County, but oaks are basically the keystone species for all Midwestern wildlife, including fungi. And of course, many plants have specific fungi that depend on them, and same thing with insects. Just as I pointed out, the giant ichneumon and the horntail, these rely on a specific fungus, and the fungus relies on them. But one day there might be habitat restoration efforts that specifically account for fungi. Restoration mycology is an emerging scientific field, and mycology in general is really just a field that is ripe for discovery. Millions of undescribed species. Citizen scientists are actually discovering new species all the time. Even on the North Branch of the Chicago River, there are amateur mycologists who have gone out and discovered new species. And this is in Chicago, where there are 9 million people. So yeah, and maybe one day people will start spreading spores from mushrooms around like they do with seeds. We have intensive seed collection programs for native plants. Maybe one day native fungi will be collecting their spores and spreading them around. Or maybe we'll start inoculating wood with different species of rare fungi. Take a page out of the Book of the Horntail. So really, there's just a lot of room for innovation. And if you want to learn about fungi, definitely I would recommend volunteering. Get out there, meet people. I'm at volunteer work days all the time, photographing mushrooms and whatnot. So yeah, I think that's it for me. Our webinars, we have more webinars coming up each week for the next 3 weeks. And if you have any questions, this would be the time. I'll leave up my contact information, and here's my iNaturalist username is there as well if you ever want to look at more of my mushroom photos, or tag me on an observation, and maybe I'll be able to ID it for you. Thanks.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Derek. We're going to take about 10 minutes here to answer questions from the audience, and we've got quite a few questions coming in the Q&A function at the bottom of the Zoom screen. So if you haven't sent yours in yet, be sure to send it now. And if we don't get through to all of them, we'll be sure to follow up with them after the fact. But to start off, we've got quite a few questions about a mushroom that's probably a lot of people's favorite, turkey tail. The first question is, for turkey tail, do they have a preference for a certain kind of wood?
I would say not as much. They're not as specific. In general, all the common mushrooms that you're going to find in the forest preserves, they will grow on oaks. But turkey tail, you can find it on ash, and there's a lot of dead ash trees in Cook County, but there isn't a whole lot of specificity.
Awesome. And we also had Ginger ask, related to any kind of mushroom, but I think she asked it right when you were talking about the turkey tails, what causes the variance in color among mushrooms of the same species?
Yeah, that's a good question. A lot of the green colors, they come from algae that grow on the mushroom, and there's some indication that this is how lichens evolved, where a fungus was growing and then an algae was just growing on it because it was a moist environment where it could survive and photosynthesize. And then for some reason, the algae decided to start living inside of the fungus, and the fungus didn't kick it out. So that process is called lichenization, and that's lichen as in, lichens, they're, sort of a combination of a fungus and an algae. So that's one explanation for some of the colors. I have a feeling that it also depends on what kind of wood they're growing on, and genetics are probably involved, but that's a really good question. I can't give you a full answer.
Awesome, thank you. So since you brought up lichens, we have a couple questions about those as well. And a general question that Elias asked was, how do scientists study lichens given the fact that they're a symbiosis between different species?
Yeah, it's pretty difficult to study fungi in general, and algae, which are also usually unicellular. So of course, there's a lot of work with microscopes, and studying lichens. There's also a lot of chemical tests. They rely on a lot of different, weird chemicals. They put a drop on the lichen and then see what color it changes, and that can help you identify the species. And then, a lot of chemical tests looking at the different types of acids and things that they secrete. Yeah, it's kind of amazing. It's about 9% of the entire world is covered in lichens. So, there definitely hasn't been enough study, but part of the reason for that is because they're pretty difficult to study.
This one might be easy or it might be really hard. Leah from the audience asked, what the coolest mushroom or your favorite mushroom that you found in the Cook County Forest Preserves?
That's not as hard as I would have thought, because a few years ago, I found a really beautiful mushroom that was entirely blue. The inside, the outside, the gills. I didn't put a picture of that in my presentation. My iNaturalist profile picture is that fungus, so you could see it there, I guess. But it's a pretty rare mushroom. It doesn't even have a common name. It is a mycorrhizal fungus, and it's something that I don't think people see very often. A lot of these mushrooms, they can be very sporadic. Sometimes the mycelia will live in the soil or in the wood for years before they ever actually make a mushroom. So, just because you're not seeing a mushroom somewhere doesn't mean that it isn't living in that area.
Awesome. Barbara had a question about fungi reproduction, and she asked, when the spores are released from mushroom or fungi, are they already fertilized, or they need to find or combine with other spores in order to grow?
They have to combine with other spores usually. So it is complicated, and as far as like sexual reproduction goes, they're not really fertilized, so to speak. And there are asexual spores where it's basically like sending off a clone of itself in spore form. But typical spores that you find in a mushroom, they're going to be haploid. So they only have one set of chromosomes, and they have to find another haploid. And actually, I should definitely preface this by saying it varies among different groups, but generally they have to find another spore, another haploid spore, and then kind of combine, and then their cells start to fuse together, and then the cells have two nuclei inside of a single cell. So yeah, it's pretty complicated, but usually they're not quite fertilized. They're not ready to produce a mushroom right when they germinate, right when the fungus spore starts to grow.
Awesome, thank you. We've have quite a few questions and comments about the story and the connection between the maples and trout lily. One question about the trout lilies, if they might have that symbiotic relationship also with oaks. And then someone took that, Joanne, took that question a step further and asked if there have been any efforts to plant trout lilies with oaks to kind of help support both species together.
So I don't know for certain that these same fungi that are mediating this interaction between maples and trout lily, I don't know that same fungus can be part of an oak mycorrhizal system. We do try to collect trout lily seed as part of our restoration efforts, and we do put it out, but in general, that's not something that has been looked into. Definitely not about that specific species, but there are a lot of other fungi out there that would definitely help to benefit oaks. And yeah, I think it would be better to start looking at full plant communities as opposed to like an individual species. But that's how science works. You start off with looking at one plant and one or two plants, and you work out from there.
Awesome. Yeah, it's a great point about looking at the whole plant community. We've just got about 3 minutes left, and sorry for everyone who's asking questions. I'm trying to keep up. We've got quite a few coming in, so if we don't get to your question, we'll get back to you via email. But for our last question, Barbara Duelist asked, what is the best set of circumstances where someone could go out and discover new mushrooms or look for mushrooms? Should they look for a certain pattern of heat or rain or right after a certain weather event? What's kind of the best time to go out looking for mushrooms?
So overall, I would say the best time if you want to see the most diversity is not going to be winter. There are definitely fungi that really only come out around winter, but late summer, early fall is going to be the best time of year, especially if it's been rainy. If you had a rainy summer, last year was horrible for mycorrhizal fungi. We just did not have enough rain. But 2 years ago and the year before that, we had nice wet summers, and there was a bumper crop of diverse array of mushrooms. So definitely a wet summer, and then a warm-ish late fall and early summer. But for winter, I would say right around freezing, and if you can find an area where the snow is keeping things a little bit more moist, or if you find a really rotten log. Yeah, I'm not sure if that covered it all.
Yeah, absolutely. That's some great spots to start. So I think that's all the time for questions we have now, but we've got more that we will follow up. So thank you everybody for participating and asking questions. And just thanks everyone who joined today, everyone who registered. We really hope to see you out again in the field sometime soon. But in the meantime, we'll keep in touch by email. You can check out our social media pages under Friends of the Forest Preserves for more updates and mushroom and fungi content. You can always find more updates at our website, friendsoftheforestpreserve.org, FOTFP.org, and more webinars. We're hosting them the next 4 weeks, each Thursday night at 6 p.m. And again, if we didn't get to your question today, we will make sure to follow up with you, and we really appreciate your participation. So please reach out to us. Derek provided his email on the last slide, and we'll also send a follow-up email with how to get in touch with Derek. Friends is a membership-based organization, so if you do feel inspired to join as a member or make any donation to support our work, Gloria Orozco, who is our Calumet field organizer, who's been hiding behind the scenes, working hard to make sure that the Zoom works properly tonight, is going to post the link to our donation page in the chat. And that's about all we have tonight. So thank you everyone so much again for joining, and take care. And thank you, Derek.
Thanks, everyone.